Welcome to another installment of conversations for our series, Who Do You Say I Am? Encountering the Newer Testament. Margaret and I are thrilled to chat today with Laura Holmes, who is professor of New Testament at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Laura, thanks for being with us to talk about First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus.
It's a delight to be here.
Great. Well, let's just start off with the question, what are these letters? They claim to be written by Paul, but they're not exactly as similar as the other letters that we've studied so far in this series.
Yeah, these three letters are more similar to each other than they are to other letters that we know were written by Paul, sometimes called undisputed letters, like nobody argues about that. It's nice to know what nobody argues about sometimes. And these letters share like several things in common. They're written to individuals in their titles, Timothy and Titus, Paul's friends and partners, co-workers in ministry. And they all seem to be concerned with some similar questions and issues, mostly around church leadership. And that's why they're called the pastorals, not because they're the only letters with a pastoral tone, which is how I usually use that word in other contexts. Many letters, most of the New Testament letters, approach things with a pastoral tone, but rather because they are concerned with pastors, with church, not just who we would think of as pastors, but with church leaders. How does the church function? And what does that look like?
Good. Can we glean from them like what's going on historically? Obviously, they were interested in leadership, but do we have a sense of like timing or what the churches are dealing with in their context?
Yeah, yes and no. These letters are not super specific in terms of their descriptions of situations. Um, we know where they claim to be written to. Timothy, written to the church in Ephesus. So a large city, multicultural church, like major city in the Roman Empire. Titus, written to Crete, which is a place that Acts says Paul went to because he got shipwrecked, not part of Paul's missionary journeys per se. So, in terms of place and location, we can't go much further than that. And in terms of timing, it's a little bit all over the place. Scholars who say these were written by the historical Paul date them late in Paul's life. Those who would say they're not written by Paul, they show more signs of later church questions, would put late first century, and I would place myself among that view. Um,
So it sounds like we don't know a lot of the sort of specific issues that these particular individuals or congregations are facing just because of that pseudonymity and dating question. But it sounds like they're written to give some leadership advice to these two congregations. What kinds of leadership advice are they giving, and what can we sort of infer from that about some of the conditions of the church at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they are focused in two ways, and that kind of gives us some idea of what the problems may have been. So the two types of advice they seem focused on are who should be teaching. That's the kind of organizational piece. And that gets constructed in what we might think of as offices or positions of leadership in the church with terms like bishop or deacon. And in other contexts, they're focused on what should be taught because the problems seem to be teaching or doctrine that is understood to be inaccurate. And actually, I really like the metaphor that these letters use for right teaching. They don't use right, they call it healthy or wholesome teaching. In the NRSV, it's translated as sound doctrine, but I like the health and illness metaphors, the way that ill doctrine is kind of infectious and spreads faster than healthy and wholesome teaching. And so they focus a lot on these kind of short, pithy we might think of as creedal statements, statements of belief for the church to kind of hang on to and center around to avoid the infectious nature of this, what they would say is inaccurate or ill doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Are they trying to kind of like pull in the ranks? Are they, and this is, I guess, depends on how you read it, right? But do they feel scared of what's out there or what could happen? You know what I mean? Are they defensive, I guess is a better word.
Yeah. So I really like the way scholar Clarice Martin kind of outlines 3 different ways to think about what might be behind this church. And I think this might be helpful. The first question is, where's that threat coming from? Is it outside the church? So then the solution is huddle in, figure it out. Is it inside the church, a kind of homegrown threat? Or is it something else? So I'll kind of go through those 3. If it's outside the church, then the threat is coming probably from Rome, where the Roman Empire is going to perceive these communities as somehow dissident or a problem. And that's where suffering would come in, some kind of persecution, tenuous relationship with authorities. And so the solution there is like, we need better PR, right? We need to keep our heads down, be like known as we are good people. We are not going to be a problem to you. And so we get that in language of like, be respectable to the empire. This is about respectability. But even there in these letters, that respectability is defined as theological. Paul, is the author here, wants the salvation, says God desires the salvation of the world. And that's the goal of this respectability, not just an easier life. So that's the outside threat on the one hand. If the real problem is doctrine, it's not from outside teachers, it's homegrown dissidents. And that threatening teaching is creating suffering in the community. And a need for resistance and faithfulness among those internal divisions. So then the letters appeal to Paul as a model of one who perseveres through, in faith, despite suffering. And these letters lift up Paul as a model to be imitated a lot. Whereas in other letters, Paul lifts up Christ as a model, and sometimes himself, but you get some of that difference. And the third option, the other that I listed, is a perception of cultural threats. That time has changed and that these communities need to go back in time to focus more on previously held values. So this is an idea of an erosion of traditional values. And so a kind of huddle down to claim that traditionalism. Scholars kind of pick and choose between those 3 models, but that gives you a sense of what might have been going on.
Yeah.
Do you have a hunch? Is there one of these that kind of resonates more with you, or how do you encounter these?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think I was mostly taught the cultural threat model when I was in seminary. And I've come more to see the kind of inside threats, the focus on the threatening teaching. I do think there's a desire for that kind of respectability, which kind of pulls from that first and third model as a solution. But there's a kind of modern like rejection of institutionalism in myself that's like, I don't like that as a solution. Right. But seeing that they do couch it theologically helps to say there are ways to see that in its context as a way to absorb change, because that's really what these letters are trying to do, to figure out a way to guide church communities through times of intense change. And I can relate to that a lot.
Yeah, I think we all can.
So at Westminster, part of my job is to sort of set up the officer training that we do for our elders and deacons here. And it's a 6-month process. It's like almost like a mini seminary for church leaders. And actually, Matt is always on deck for 2 weeks at the start of it to teach the Bible and leadership. And so this is actually a question for Matt. Matt, do you draw from these epistles for any of your slides that day? Is this, because we get a lot of text here on qualifications for office. I'm not sure that that's a way that modern churches in the mainline are using this now. Talk to us about what these letters sort of say into the present moment about leadership and the challenges of sort of reading them in that way.
Are you asking me?
Yeah, you know what? Sorry, yeah, Matt. I guess I want to start by asking Matt, and then I'm queuing up for Laura. So, Matt, do you quote from these? I mean, do you pull these in?
I can keep it quick. I don't.
Okay.
And not that Matt needs me to defend that choice, but a defense of that choice could be the descriptions of qualifications for the leaders in these positions match a lot of kind of virtues in the broader Greco-Roman world. And so in that sense, they're cultural virtues and a Christian key almost. And in that sense, we need to think of them in their cultural context rather than here are the designations for elders of all time. Because as much as the pastorals talk about these positions, they don't say what they do very much, and they don't say how they relate to each other, which is how my denomination of the United Methodist Church thinks of deacons in quite a different way than the Presbyterian Church, right? And we pull the language from these letters, but we don't pull the job descriptions precisely because of the cultural context and the changes over time.
Yeah, like it doesn't say, a bishop should be good at bishoping. It just says a bishop should manage his household well, and it's always his. Which means maybe we should move on to some of these specific criteria, right? So my hunch is that if anybody knows anything about First Timothy, it's chapter 2, where the author is quite explicit about not permitting women to speak or to have any kind of authority in a gathering of the community, and says things like, if she has things to say, she can ask at home. I mean, it's fulfills all of the worst stereotypes that have probably have some roots in this letter, in this culture. So that's one of the reasons I don't quote from it in officer training. But like you said, Laura, it certainly comes from a different time and place, and there's pressures going on. Like, do we know anything about what's going on behind a passage like that? Because I think a lot of people either skip over it or carry a lot of scars from it, and all of those for good reasons.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think about that text, I think some of my students, particularly some of my women students who want to know more about this text because they've felt a call from God for ministry, and someone else in their life or someone's else in their lives have used this text to say, no, you don't. And the first thing I start with, this text does not have to be your best friend. Like, there are limits to what we can do to redeem a text to make it say good news. But I do think paying attention to the details of the text means that we can at least be more attuned to what it actually says rather than what we've been told it says. So overall, when these epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, talk about women, they don't do so in ways that I think are universally fabulous. I'll just put it that way. Their overall goal is to describe women within a cultural stereotype, almost. A good woman in Greco-Roman society is submissive to her husband, well, is married, first off, is submissive to her husband, self-controlled, chaste, a good household manager, and kind. There are a few of those I can champion. I feel like our children's time sermons at my church often end with petitions to be kind, whether you are male or female or anything. But beyond that, this taps into a stereotype about women in the Greco-Roman world that we get from lots of other texts, that women could not be self-controlled. That's the key. But what happens in 1 Timothy 2 is that the language there, women are to be silent and learn in submission, gets taken out of this letter and made as a statement for all time. So are there indications beyond just an interpretive stance that this wasn't actually instructions for all women everywhere? The passage starts in chapter 2, verse 8 of 1 Timothy, and it starts with instructions to men. And there it starts like it's going to be universalizing. All men in every place are to be, let's see, not angry and have no arguments. We're doing really well with that one. And then it moves on to men. So we start with a kind of universalizing principle, at least a generic one. But the women are described much more specifically. The instructions focus on their dress, high social markers, talking about gold and pearls, that they have outfits to choose from. Talks about hairstyles, which means they have slaves to do their hair. There's all these indications that this is not every woman. This is a group of very high status women in this church, presumably the Ephesian church. One of my colleagues, Carla Works, calls these the Real Housewives of Ephesus. And in that sense, this is a particular group of women who are doing particular things in this congregation. And so because of that, they are given particular directions, basically, or the church leaders are given particular directions about them. And those directions could have been shut it all down, kick them out. And sometimes it sounds like that. Instructions to silence can be, are oppressive. But in their context, the solution is actually more about teaching and learning. Silence was the posture of learning. And so the author is saying these women don't need to be shut up. They need to be taught so that then they could teach, is the implied but not said follow-up statement. And so this goes into that previous conversation about one of the problems here is the invasive, infectious teaching. These women have been apparently quite susceptible to it. And so the letter is trying to say, get them to where they can learn what they need to know, and then they can teach. Learning is done in silence, and the silence that they are asking for was actually described earlier in that chapter as the peaceable life that all are called to live. So this is a passage asking wealthy women with status to learn before teaching others. I can pause there.
Yeah, I mean, that's so, because so often this gets used as therefore do not teach rather than therefore do, I just feel like that's been the sort of ongoing life of this text. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. This sort of connects. We talked to Carla Works about, was it First and Second Corinthians, Matt? Was that her? Yeah, and she talked about the sort of Corinthians version of this passage, which is functioning differently, but still that question of how does attending to markers of status as well as markers of gender help us to go deeper into the context here?
Yeah.
I need to confess I misspoke too when I characterized 1 Timothy 2. I blended it with 1 Corinthians 14 in terms of some of the things it says and does not say. So there's a sense in which some of this is connected to what we talked about at the beginning. Is that fair to say that part of what's going on is a kind of, we've got to figure out who we are in this society? And like you said, something like these are common cultural norms in Christian guys. I forgot exactly how you said it, Laura. Is some of that shining through here in this section as well?
I think it is because the presuppositions or stereotypes about women that are kind of carried forward in this text, right? That women can't be self-controlled.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things are very much part of gendered expectations in their culture. We have our own. And I think in that sense, the letter, the author, the church is trying to figure out what does that then look like? And different early Christian churches made different decisions in that regard about whether it was about gender, about economics, about slavery and freedom. All of those things get kind of cut and crossed in different ways in different communities.
Go ahead, Margaret.
Yeah. So can I, Matt, do you have more on this, or can I take us in another?
You can go ahead. Yeah.
So how is Second Timothy sort of distinctive here, or we've spent a lot of time on First Timothy and Titus. What's different? What's similar in Second Timothy to this other part of the set?
Yeah, Second Timothy has similarities, like we've already talked about, with the focus on healthy doctrine and those kinds of things. But it leans more towards questions of what to do with suffering. There's qualities in Second Timothy that some scholars, like Mike Gorman, say sound a lot more like Paul. They get at more of this intimate relationship between Paul and Timothy than maybe First Timothy does. And so because of that, it feels more like we're reading a personal letter, right? First Timothy may be written to an individual, but it doesn't, at least to me, it doesn't sound extremely personal. Second Timothy has more of those like teaching directly to Timothy, even like a famous aside, like take a little wine for your stomach, Timothy, after dinner, right? Like there's like these little pieces that get more to an interpersonal relationship.
This is just occurring to me now, but he kind of doesn't even name drop like Timothy's mom and grandmother as sort of faithful influences in his life, which seems to, yeah, okay.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Margaret. Yeah, it speaks to the question of women more broadly in these letters. First Timothy 2 gets all the playtime in terms of thinking about women in ministry in these letters. But even back in First Timothy, there's possibility, it's unclear, but there's possibility that women may have been deacons, like in the text, might also be wives. We're not sure. The Greek can mean either women or wives. But also widows seem to have a role in some kind of leadership. Again, we're not clear. But there are places in these letters that show women are responsible for various aspects of church life. And Lois and Eunice get a call out to say that Timothy's faith is grounded on theirs, that they are responsible for shaping and forming his faith. And that actually is connected to a much broader theme in Second Timothy about the focus of the importance of the community in times of suffering. The letter calls out households by name as communities that have strengthened one another in times of suffering. And I read the appeal to remember Eunice and Lois as part of that broader claim that in times of suffering, it is the community where we most encounter God.
It's a good point. I think what you bring up, the sense of like a legacy is there in Second Timothy, which, we've spent months going through the Gospels and Paul, which have an urgency about them that don't always think about future generations down the road, right? And here's a letter that looks back, looks forward in some ways. Maybe because it's just that sense of urgency has died down a little bit. There's more of a sense of who are we going to be and how are we going to pass along this good news? Is that fair? A fair characterization?
I think so. There's a kind of coming to terms with the fact that Jesus' return isn't as immediate as we thought. And that means that the church needs to figure out how to keep going when it's still not a legal entity in the Roman Empire, when there's still no sense that there's still no security that what they're doing can continue. And so in that context, yeah, that's what these letters are trying to figure out.
Yeah. What's the good news in these letters?
Yeah.
What is the gospel?
I love that that's a key question. And in part, when I think about that question in these letters, I think about those kind of core nuggets of those kind of short creedal statements. That's one of the things I think about. So, for example, one of them is from Titus. And I'm not one to quote a lot of verses from Titus. I don't know that I could quote you another verse from Titus. But this one includes the line, "It's not by works of righteousness that I've done, but because of God's mercy that God saved me." I know that because it was a song I grew up learning at camp. Those words were put to a song. And to me, the centrality of like the short statements, the songs, Psalm 23, those kind of core pieces of faith that we keep returning to, whatever they are. I know how grounding that's been for me. At one point in my life, somebody said, "Why do you stay United Methodist?" It's been a good question, especially the last few years. And one of the answers that I've given is the songs, the hymns. And those are the kinds of things that I think these letters call us back to. What are those core touchstones, whether they're memories, scripture passages, or songs that we come back to? I also think these letters feel remarkably relevant in the issues they struggle with, even if we want to kind of engage them more in conversation about the solutions they choose. Because these are letters about a divided church. And if there's one thing that we know in society now, it's a lot of division. And so one of the admonitions that I know I need to hear is to not engage when the conversation clearly just wants to stoke division. That's again from Titus. And I feel like that also seems pretty relevant. I got two more. One,
We have time.
we have time. One is that these letters really focus. This actually goes back to your question, Margaret, about Eunice and Lois. These letters really focus on mentoring, like what you said, Matt, about the carrying on from one generation to another. It's not just here are the little scripture passages or creedal statements you need to know, but what does this faith look like lived? And how can we communicate that across generations? How can generations mentor one another? All of that gets modeled and lifted up in these letters. And one of the things that I love is that it says mentoring is not just for the benefit of the individual. That's how I usually think about it. Like I'm mentoring this person so that they can succeed in whatever they're doing. But I think these letters actually show that mentoring is essential for the well-being of the church. And that's a shift from the way that I normally think about it. And I think that's helpful. And lastly, I think these letters are really good at highlighting the connectedness, the inseparability between belief, what we think, and what we do. And they do that in a different way than other texts in the New Testament. They do kind of keep those as two different things, that we can think things and then do them. It's, I think, kind of similar to James in the New Testament. I don't know if you're going to do a session on James.
We are.
Well, preview. James like separates faith and action. And in some ways, these letters are doing something similar, where what you believe is one thing over here, but it is absolutely connected to what you do. And I feel like that is something that we need to keep reminding ourselves and learning.
That's great. We've hit our time, unfortunately. I still have more questions here to go, but We're very grateful, Laura. Thanks for your wisdom and for taking your time and not just reporting out what these letters say, but helping us understand them better and criticize them better and ultimately appreciate them better, I think.